On here. All right. Hello, everyone. Starting the remote sensing session. Doesn't work.
Testing. Hey, everybody, if we could have your attention. I got you. Get the big announcer voice. Hey, if we could have your attention on the main stage here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. We're about ready to start our afternoon session. It is remote sensing. And our first speaker is Martha Anderson from the USDA ARS. And the talk title is on the synergy between flux towers and remote sensing and understanding landscape water use. Martha, you can go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. Well, I wish I could be there today. Travel at the beginning of a fiscal year is always difficult for in the government, and this year was particularly complicated. But glad to join you virtually. So yeah, I work for the USDA Ag Research Service, mostly on mapping evapotranspiration over a range of spatial scales. And today I just wanted to share a few thoughts on how we use flux tower data to evaluate and improve our remote sensing models, but also how we use the remote sensing to kind of extrapolate those tower data up to field and larger scale. So it's really a synergistic utilization. Let's see, trying to advance. Use the buttons there. Okay, so the ET mapping approach that we use in our group is based on surface energy balance. The primary remote sensing inputs are maps of land surface temperature that we can get from satellites with thermal infrared imaging sensors. So here we're kind of exploiting the strong physical connection that exists between evaporative cooling and the temperature of that evaporating surface. With the current set of Earth observing satellites that are available to us today, we can make these maps over a broad range in spatial and temporal scales. If we're working at continental scales, we'll often use thermal data from the geostationary weather satellites, the GOES satellites over the US, because they give us such good temporal sampling. There's also a family of moderate resolution polar orbiting systems, MODIS, VIIRS, that can get us down to 500 meters spatial resolution about once per day. However, most of the applications in agriculture are at finer scales, at kind of the 100-meter scale or finer, supported by Landsat, where we can really see the water use on a field-by-field basis. But unfortunately, the temporal support at that scale is not great, especially during the rainy season when there's persistent cloud cover. So more recently, we've been turning towards more of a multi-sensor data fusion approach to field scale ET mapping. We're using a data fusion, the StarFM data fusion algorithm that was developed by my colleague Feng Gao. And it serves to kind of combine the really good temporal sampling we have from some of these coarser resolution satellites with the good spatial detail that we get from Landsat. So using data fusion, we can build up high resolution ET data cubes. It's just stacks of ET images, 30 meters resolution currently, daily time steps, and we can build these up over periods of multiple years and then use them to study how the water use patterns are changing over the landscape as the climate is changing and as the land use is changing. We have also started to experiment with augmenting our temporal sampling at the fine spatial scale with other sources of Landsat, like thermal imaging from EcoStress, from VIIRS I5 band, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We've constructed these data cubes over a number of sites across the United States and internationally, often agricultural sites. we have targeted, for example, USDA ARS long-term agroecosystem research sites or LTAR sites. And these are areas where ARS scientists have built up long-term biophysical records about the soil, the land management, yields. These sites all have one or more flux towers in them, so we can do some quantitative evaluation. And some of them have Ameriflux towers in them as well that we utilize as well. All these cubes are being used for a range of applications in science, and I just want to highlight a couple of these applications today, namely irrigation management in vineyards in the Central Valley of California, and then also impacts of regenerative grazing practices. So vineyard irrigation management, it's kind of a special case in irrigation management because these vineyards are often deficit irrigated to induce a little stress on the vines so that they can improve the grape quality for the wine production. And there's certainly value in being able to monitor that stress level and that water use over large areas to precisely control the irrigation application. In addition, vineyards are oftentimes located in more water-limited areas where there's a need to find ways to use the water more sustainably. So this GrapeX experiment, which grew up as a collaboration with E&J Gallo Winery, was developed to create some remote sensing-based irrigation management strategies in vineyards that were going to end up using less water overall while maintaining or hopefully even improving the grape quality and yield. So in support of GrapeX, the GrapeX team established a suite of intensive field sites, sampling the gradient in conditions across the California wine growing region, from the hilly, the cooler climates up in Sonoma County by our Borelli field site, down to really, really flat and dry and hot conditions by Fresno, by the Ripperdan site. This Lodi site here in the center is our longest running site that was established back in 2013. At that site, the team instrumented 2 side-by-side blocks of Pinot Noir. They were of slightly different maturity levels, different vegetation cover fractions, installed eddy covariance systems, networks of soil moisture, soil temperature, radiation sensors within these 2 blocks. So to date, we have built up about a 10-year kind of ET time series over this particular site. And we've watched the water use patterns change within the 2 blocks, but also within the surrounding landscape. Kyle Knipper has done a lot of investigations of these data cubes in this paper of 2019. He is showing the agreement between model time series extracted in the tower footprints in both blocks compared to the tower observations of daily ET. Very good agreement. Also in the shading, he's indicating the variation in ET across each block. It's not uniform. Big variations responding to variations in soil texture and vine health and topography within each block that we can retrieve from the remote sensing data. And here is let's hope it runs. This is an animation of cumulative water use over this area generated by integrating through one of these data cubes. We can see some time behavior here. There's early irrigation of nut orchards in the east there, big water users in the Central Valley, some young vineyards to the south, getting some early irrigation to help get the vine roots established. We've got, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we have our 2 side-by-side Pinot Noir blocks here in the center. Up in the northwest, there's a stand of eucalyptus trees, some residential areas. And then the background is a natural grassland that's senescing in the spring as the irrigation starts ramping up. So with the remote sensing, you see, we get a lot of contextual information about what's going on at those 2 flux tower sites, both spatially and temporally. Uh-oh. My program is kind of hanging here. Not sure what's going on. I might need to restart if that's okay. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and restart this quickly. Sorry about this. Okay. Let's try this again. Okay, can you see me again? I'm hoping you can. As I mentioned, we've tried to start more recently augmenting our Landsat sampling, which is indicated by the red diamonds in this plot, with some ET retrievals from other thermal data sources that are similar to Landsat, from EcoStress, which is an instrument on the space station, and also from the VIIRS, a higher resolution thermal channel. Jiazhu in this paper here from 2022 demonstrated that these different thermal data sources can be combined effectively and consistently, really help to kind of flesh out some of the features in the seasonal water use curve that we might miss by just using Landsat alone. The red solid line here is the fused daily time series. And you can see in this case in 2020, the fluxes are lower, the ET fluxes are lower than they were in prior years. In that year, all the vines were cut in both of these blocks. They were grafted to new varietals. You can see the regrowth trends. The vines regrow very quickly. You can see regrowth both in the eddy covariance fluxes and in the remote sensing data there. Now, this ratio of actual to reference ET actually plays a fairly big role in irrigation management and the management factor that's used in regulated deficit irrigation, which is a practice that aims at supplying the crop with some fraction of its total crop water requirement. We can see from this plot that the model is able to retrieve both this kind of stress factor, this stress ratio, as well as the total consumptive use. So here it's able to detect lower rates of stress in Site 2 in 2016 compared to 2015, where the irrigation rates were somewhat less. So sensitive to stress as well as total water use. If we map this management factor up over the landscape, we get some information about water management behavior in the area. We can see some vineyards that are being managed at lower values of management factor in the lower tail of this distribution. These are vineyards being managed at higher levels of stress. Other vineyards are being in the blue, are being managed in the upper tail of the distribution. And these tend to be, again, those younger vineyards being given extra water to help get the blocks established. So again, contextual information we can derive from the remote sensing, in this case about water use behavior over the landscape. So Kyle Knipper, who is an ARS colleague at Davis, California, he's running our ET modeling system in near real time over these 3 intensive field sites. He supplies Gallo with weekly maps of evapotranspiration and also this evaporative stress index. They ingest the data into an irrigation dashboard, which you can see here, along with some other satellite-based indicators, and they use this data collectively to develop irrigation recommendations for the upcoming week, and they've been very happy with this data source. So now I'm just going to switch gears just a little bit. Another big experiment we've been involved in is a multi-institution collaborative looking at the impacts of regenerative grazing on soil health and vegetation health in pasture lands. As with the GRAPEX study, the group has established a suite of intensive field sites trying to sample the gradient in grassland climate conditions across the United States. So we have a intensive site in Wyoming where the vegetation is kind of dry and scrubby. We also have Oklahoma, which is sitting right here on the precipitation line. And then we have conditions in Michigan that are greener and wetter. So really sampling the full gradient. Our group is supplying to this cooperative effort time series of ET and leaf area index, other vegetation indices developed through data fusion. So we can study the response of these managed pastures to the management practices over time. So we're just going to take a quick look at this Oklahoma site, which is right above the Red River on the border with Texas. This Red River facility, or this Oklahoma intensive site, has two sets of pastures in the Red River grazing facility, and then also a set of pastures at the Coffee Ranch, kind of nestled in some forested areas. We've developed time series of ET data here. Here we're showing an animation of cumulative ET again. You can really get a sense for the different phenologies, water use phenologies of the forested components of this landscape compared to the grassland components. So here at the Red River, they took the set of pastures and kind of subdivided them into six sub-pastures. The top three are being managed prescriptively, kind of business as usual. The bottom three are being managed adaptively. They're moving the cattle from section to section, giving sections some resting period before they're regrazed. And we're gonna contrast the response of these two systems to these different grazing practices. Quanterra systems installed eddy covariance systems in each of these sub pastures, and they're going to be running through the lifetime of the project, which is going to be about 5 years. We've done some initial comparisons between the model estimates of the energy budget partitioning on Landsat over past dates with the measurements at these tower sites, and the partitioning is really pretty good in this case. The fused daily ET time series from the model have a mean absolute error of about 0.5 millimeter per day, which is really pretty good for remote sensing data. So given that good performance, we've been using the model to study how representative these towers are of the surrounding area. So we're kind of pretending like the model represents truth in terms of time response. We have a 3x3 moving window that we move around each tower, extract some model time series, and then compute some correlative statistics with the tower observations. This is a map of Nash-Sutcliffe coefficient of efficiency. So the green areas here are indicating areas where the model time series are agreeing very well with the flux tower time series. You can see there's kind of a structure in the middle of the set of pastures that has good performance, and that's fairly kind of stable. That structure is stable from tower to tower with somewhat different levels of agreement. We have to check the flux data at this this particular tower site, especially during the rain, to see if some additional QC is required. And down in the adaptive towers, again, that structure is delineated. Now, this 32A tower was missing its fluxes for most of the rainy season. You can see in that case, the agreement between the tower and the model is pretty uniform over the whole set of pastures. So we're thinking that structure we're seeing at the other towers is likely due to the differential response of different parts of the pasture to rainfall. I'm getting a hold of a high resolution DEM. We want to check and see if this is due to some kind of micro topography across the pasture. Started doing some analysis of the Coffee Ranch pastures. This is work in progress. A little bit more of a challenge here because these pastures are kind of small compared to the pixel size, especially of the moderate resolution fusion backbone time series. And also there's some potential impacts on the fetch and filtering by wind direction that we're going to have to do. So this is ongoing, and we'll complete similar analyses at the other 2 intensive sites as well. So just wrapping up here, some ongoing research questions that we have been kind of grappling with as a research team. And the first is energy balance closure. We're always faced with the question of should we try to close these eddy covariance fluxes, or should we not close them when we compare to the energy balance model? And if we do try to close them, what's the best kind of closure technique to use? Now, Bill Kusta is proposing an AGU Chapman workshop on this issue, so you can keep your eyes open for that one. Another issue we are looking at, especially in the Central Valley, when we're looking at irrigated crops there, is the effect of advection off the hot, dry surroundings on the fluxes, the energy balance of the measured fluxes, and also can the remote sensing models capture the enhanced evaporative fluxes under those high advective conditions. We're very interested in techniques for separating ET into E and T, both from a measurement standpoint and from a modeling standpoint. And one thing I'm very interested in is a reliable metric that can help me select towers, especially from the global set of towers that are appropriate for directly evaluating models at different spatial resolutions, at 500 meters up to 5 kilometers resolution, in terms of local homogeneity in land cover and moisture conditions. So that wraps it up for me. Thanks for listening.
All right, thanks, Martha.
I don't.
Oh, hi, Martha. This is Russ.
Oh, great. Hi, Russ.
I was gonna. I made.
Hmm. I'm not hearing anything on my end. I'm sorry. I can't hear.
Could maybe type it in the chat. Okay.
Now I can hear you.
Can-
Now I can hear you. Try it again. Yeah.
Okay, the question was, can you apply these same techniques to carbon fluxes?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. All right, there, the echo comes and goes. We do have a carbon flux enabled version of this 2-source model where the transpiration and the carbon assimilation fluxes are coupled. It certainly needs more evaluation, but I think we absolutely could be doing the same kind of evaluations for carbon fluxes.
Move to our next speaker. Mute myself, keep myself muted. I guess I Hey, okay. So less people that have active microphones. Cool. Oh, that's my email.
Okay. Cool. Cool, great. Okay, I'm Lewis Koenig. I'm a PhD student at the University of Utah. And I'm going to talk about some work that we have submitted and currently in review in environmental research letters looking at solar-induced fluorescence, or SIF, from satellites over California's Sierra Nevada, and tracking patterns of photosynthesis. Okay, so this is a three-dimensional map of above ground biomass over the Western US. And I've kind of shown this here to emphasize this pattern of concentration of biomass in hilly and mountainous terrain in the Western US. And these montane forests can be pretty dynamic. And I've highlighted the Sierra Nevadas in California because particularly we see these areas being very susceptible to disturbance from drought, insect-related pathogens, and wildfires. It's this combination of complex topography and the kind of volatility of the carbon sink that adds a lot of uncertainty to the carbon cycle over mountainous regions. So obviously we want to measure this. We want to see how disturbance and productivity change over time in these kinds of areas, but this is sort of our classic sampling challenge because we only have a handful of flux tower sites in the Sierra Nevada, which are really the most direct way for us to measure carbon fluxes. So naturally, we look towards satellite observations to fill in the gaps where we don't have ground-based data. So I'm going to focus specifically on photosynthesis, or gross primary productivity, GPP. And we typically measure GPP from space using a combination of known land cover type, meteorology, and these greenness-based satellite reflectance indices like NDVI, EVI, and NIRV that mostly tell us about the chlorophyll content and canopy structure. But the Western US is mostly characterized by evergreen needle-leaf forests, where these forests will retain their green needles year-round, even if it gets very cold. So this greenness-informed method kind of breaks down here. Luckily, we know that all plants and all ecosystems emit a weak signal called fluorescence as a sort of byproduct of photosynthesis, to put it really simply. We call this solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, or SIF. And it's this weak signal in the red and far red end of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can measure through very thin spectral windows of atmospheric absorption on specialized equipment, instruments on a handful of orbiting satellites. So we would love to recruit SIF to tell us more about GPP over the Sierra Nevadas and mountain regions in general. And we've seen pretty good correlation so far between SIF and GPP, particularly at tower and some satellite scales, but there's still this question of how SIF and GPP, the relationship between them sort of scales across seasons and across land cover types, particularly in mountainous terrain. So, but luckily, there's been some good work done on the flux towers in this elevational transect in the Southern Sierras, led by Mike Golden of UC Irvine and his colleagues. And so there's two kind of important notes. So California has a Mediterranean climate, so most of its precipitation falls in the winter, and at high elevations, this falls as snow, which melts in the spring and summer. So this sort of feeds into soil moisture for lower lying areas into the drier season. And also the trees in these forests have developed adaptations of very deep root systems in order to access subsurface water well into the dry season to sort of alleviate the impact of seasonal drought. So with that, we know that the lower elevations of forests are the most water limited. They have peak GPP in mid-spring, but then photosynthesis drops off into the summer. We know that mid-elevation forests have the highest annual productivity with GPP in late spring, early summer, and a little bit of moisture limitation going into the fall. And At higher elevations, we sort of transition to an energy limited regime where we have winter dormancy followed by peak GPP in midsummer and no moisture limitation, really. So this sort of forms these expectations of the limitations to GPP in the Sierra Nevadas. We kind of summarize this in a Havmahler diagram. So this shows the seasonality on the x-axis and the elevational patterns on the y-axis. And really what we want to do pretty simply is just take satellite derived SIF and compare the elevational and seasonal patterns to these expectations and some other estimates of GPP in the region. So our domain focuses on the central and southern Sierra Nevadas, and we use the European Space Agency's land cover product to take just the majority evergreen needleaf forest pixels. We sample SIF from the TRPOMI satellite instrument monthly and at about the highest spatial resolution that we can, which is about 4 kilometers. And this is a daily average and topography corrected SIF product. And we compare this to a model data GPP product that's global. It's called FluxCom, and it's based on MODIS reflectance indices, but also trained on a global data set of eddy covariance fluxes that don't include the Sierra Nevadas. We also compare it to modeled GPP from process-based models, community land model, CLM, with 2 configurations. One sort of an out-of-the-box run with biogeochemistry. Another one is using satellite prescribed leaf area observations from MODIS. So, and finally, we want to compare with the 4 flux towers we have in the southern Sierra Nevadas from the Ameriflux and Neon networks. And I should note that the time ranges of these flux data don't all align with each other or with the TRPOMI SIF data, which is a big challenge. So we have aggregated across all available data years to represent a mean seasonal cycle at each of these sites. So this sort of shows the patterns of SIF, FluxCom, GPP, and simulated GPP from CLM as these Havmahler diagrams. And I'll just say that we found a challenge with the SIF data, which is that we had to take out a lot of the high elevation snow covered data due to these biases from high reflected radiance from the snow. But you can kind of see that the patterns of SIF really do look like our expectations of the limitations of GPP. And we generally are seeing peak signals between about 1,000 and 1,500 meters in elevation, and all of these except for the default CLM simulated GPP. But where we find the most divergence is in the timing. So SIF is centered around June. We see FluxCom extending productivity almost all the way into fall. And then the model GPP has a peak much earlier, April, May, earlier in the spring. And in which and then on the other hand, FluxCom doesn't seem to really know anything about moisture limitation except for maybe the very low elevations. And so SIF is sort of seems to be a balance between these two. And if we aggregate everything over time, so just look at the elevational distributions of all of these gridded data sets, we see that TRPOMI SIF here in red and FluxCom in yellow have almost identical elevation distributions across the Sierras. But if we do the same thing and aggregate over space so that we look at the seasonality of all of these data sets, we see that SIF is looking a little bit closer to this really moisture limited CLM model GPP. So looking at flux towers kind of helps ground us a little bit. And I'll issue kind of a caveat, which is that we have a huge limitation in trying to scale from towers to these relatively large SIF pixels, especially when they're not overlapping in time. So some limitations there, but nonetheless, we can actually kind of see a consistent pattern where the FluxCom GPP has this late season bias. And we do some statistical cross correlation analyses, which I haven't shown, but I'll just say is we find that SIF falls within plus or minus about 1 month of the Flux Tower GPP, whereas this FluxCom product is pretty consistently bias in the late season, especially at these low to mid elevations. But that kind of goes away once we get to the higher elevation flux sites, where we don't have any moisture limitation. The challenge here with SIF is that the SIF pixel is picking up a lot more barren, rocky areas that are outside of the flux footprint. So it's kind of hard to make these comparisons, but nonetheless, I think we found some interesting stuff here. We think that Trapami SIF generally catches the right elevations of where photosynthesis is occurring. If we assume that FluxCom is a pretty good comparison. But we see that those two products sort of diverge in the summer, and we can kind of tie that to this late season bias or lack of moisture limitation in FluxCom. But that SIF might actually capture some seasonal moisture limitation at these low to mid elevations. And so we've always kind of been a little bit skeptical of what SIF can tell us, and it seems like SIF might be a pretty promising tool. Maybe it's not perfect, but it is telling us something pretty productive about photosynthesis over these really sharp elevational gradients. And so it seems like it could be a pretty good tool, especially for merging model and data into sort of data assimilation techniques. But I think we need to spend a lot more time looking at the interannual variability of SIF to see really how well it tracks droughts and these kind of disturbance patterns in evergreen forests. But also we still have some work to do with processing the data, as we saw in high elevations with snow cover. So we're still getting there, but so far SIF is looking pretty good. So that's it. I'll take questions.
This is with elevation gradient, and I wonder what's the I guess the vegetation cover. Are you going from a lower tree line to upper tree line? What's the cover?
Yeah, we're basically going from the lower bounds of where the dominant evergreen forests are in terms of near the Central Valley, all the way up to basically where we start approaching the timberline going into alpine tundra and this rocky high alpine terrain. So we kind of expect it to drop off because the forests are not as dense when we get closer to high elevation tree line, but also kind of the same once we get into like low elevation woody savanna.
Thank you. We should probably move on. Thanks again. All right, our next speaker is Steve Kannenberg from West Virginia University.
Nice. It's all good on Zoom. Okay,
Sweet.
all right. I never thought I'd find myself in a remote sensing session, but here I am. And the secret is there's not actually that much remote sensing in this. So yeah, I guess don't boo me off the stage. You can yell at me later or something. All right. So, you know, we've spent this whole day kind of walking around this beautiful northeastern hardwood forests and thinking about fluxes. And really what I want to do for the first couple slides here is convince all of you that this ecosystem right here, this dryland, is also incredibly important, in some regards just as important as this you know, hardwood forest landscape that we find ourselves in. Okay, cool, we fixed that. So I want you to all think about you know, how carbon and water flows through a dryland ecosystem like this versus something like hardwood forest. And I think for a lot of you who work in more mesic environments, you might think, you know, this type of ecosystem probably doesn't play much of a role in carbon and water cycling globally, right? Like it looks really hot, it looks really dry, it's sparsely vegetated, but that's not quite right. Dryland ecosystems like this really exert a disproportionate influence on carbon and water cycling globally. And the reason for this isn't because there's a bunch of water flowing through there. It's right in the name. It's in the name dryland. It's not happening. It's not taking up and storing a bunch of carbon. But what drylands are is incredibly heterogeneous over space and over time in their carbon and water cycle. So just again, thinking about this picture, that vegetation right along that little river is probably a pretty consistent carbon sink as long as that doesn't dry up, which in this case it doesn't. Whereas, maybe some of the vegetation on that slope to the left of it is less a carbon sink and might be a little bit more neutral. And the same thing kind of happens temporally. Like you think of that hill slope again, if you go into the daily or half hourly flux data, if you had a site right there, you'd probably see that it changes from a net source to a net sink of carbon multiple times in a given growing season. And it's this variability over time, over space, that make drylands really important for determining things like the strength of the land carbon sink every year. It's just they're really dynamic and changing over time in space. And it's not just that their carbon and water cycles are important, it's that their lags. Okay, it's that dryland ecosystems in many cases are kind of a leading edge of climate change impacts, because in many cases, these are the biomes that are heating and aridifying most drastically. And, if you've paid attention to the news over the past few years, you've probably seen, every summer there's some new historic heat wave. There are, wildfires, and the smoke was blanketing even the eastern US this summer. So a lot of you probably noticed that if you're based around here. We've seen really bad droughts pop up that cause pretty serious impacts for humanity, kind of exemplified by these bathtub rings here, and also widespread vegetation mortality events. But because of all of this kind of heterogeneity in carbon and water cycling in drylands, there are a number of really basic ecological questions that, in my opinion, really haven't quite been resolved yet in these ecosystems. In particular, just a basic knowledge of what environmental drivers are most important, which seems like a pretty basic question to ask, yes, but I think it's because of this heterogeneity that, decades later, we're still debating things like, is soil moisture or is atmospheric aridity more important for controlling dryland ecosystem function? And sometimes this is phrased as a dichotomy, I think falsely, but still we don't have that great of a handle on what controls dryland ecosystem function. And this is where eddy covariance towers come in and are particularly suited, I think, towards tackling these types of questions in drylands, right? Because they have this spatial footprint of, kind of a stand. It's above an individual plant, but not quite, at a grid scale. So it can capture a lot of this, landscape heterogeneity. And likewise, the data are coming in at a half hourly scale. You can aggregate it to daily or whatever. So you can really capture a lot of these kind of, hot moments in ecosystem fluxes that are super important and kind of a key characteristic of drylands. So what we ended up doing was kind of amassing all 21 dryland Ameriflux sites that met a bunch of different data criteria that we had with regards to their aridity. They were all like under 0.5 aridity index, had at least a few years of data and were kind of free of any sort of active management or disturbance. The cool thing about this network in drylands especially is that they have really great depth profiles of soil moisture. So we can kind of ask some questions with regards to different soil moisture pools. We just constrained the data to the growing season in the daytime in order to isolate periods when vegetation is most likely active, and just did a really basic correlation analysis correlating daily rates of ET and GPP with all of the different environmental drivers that these flux towers measure. And that's what you're going to see in this picture. On the y-axis is the Pearson's correlation coefficient, which for those of you who aren't aware, represents really just kind of the sensitivity of a flux to a given environmental driver. It's the slope of kind of these standardized variables. So a higher coefficient either direction means that flux is more responsive to variability in these given environmental drivers, which you can see on the x-axis. Things, atmospheric drivers, temperature, VPD, light, and soil moisture bin into these kind of 4 discrete depths from the shallow layers 0 to 10 centimeters all the way down to this deep layer, which is 50 to 100 centimeters. And there are a couple things that probably pop out. Number one is that kind of in the aggregate, these correlation coefficients were largest for all of these layers of soil moisture than for any of the atmospheric drivers. And really only in the aggregate VPD was a kind of a significant correlation coefficient. It deviated from 0. There's also an interesting nuance within all of these different layers of soil moisture too. You can kind of see a very consistent correlation coefficient across all sites for GPP, which is pretty intuitive. Dryland vegetation as kind of a life history strategy generally is pretty deeply rooted. So they're responsive to soil moisture across all these layers. Whereas the kind of ET correlation coefficient tapers off a little bit. which again makes sense. You're getting that transpiration signal from deep roots, but you're getting a lot of that signal from soil evaporation. Before I go to that one, so what I think this shows is, pretty convincing evidence that soil moisture is really important for controlling variability and pretty high frequency ecosystem fluxes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't periods when light, temperature, vapor pressure deficit is really important for dryland ecosystem function. And so I'm just showing one graph here, but we did a bunch of these kind of data binning, data subsetting exercises, trying to find periods of time when these correlation coefficients would increase. And sure enough, when we got down to about the 10% wettest observations, so these are largely periods right after rainfall when soil moisture is really elevated, that's when we really see these correlation coefficients start to increase here, and these atmospheric drivers be more important in driving carbon and water fluxes. So it seems like a pretty simple and intuitive answer here. I think, what environmental drivers are most important for drylands? The answer is probably soil moisture most of the time, with potentially a more limited role for something like light or vapor pressure deficit when soil water limitations are alleviated. And I think that wasn't super surprising to me. It was neat to show it in that way, but I think this result is a little bit disappointing if our goal is to understand dryland ecosystem function generally, because we have 21 of these towers in drylands, which is great, but that doesn't come close to representing the diversity of drylands even in the Western US, let alone globally. And we don't have great networks of soil moisture monitoring, especially these deep layers. A lot of our models of soil moisture, especially in drylands, aren't that great, again, because of this heterogeneity question. And so I think it's really an ongoing question, and this is where the remote sensing comes in. So if you're sleeping until now, you can wake up. What data products can we use that accurately capture what these flux towers are seeing about drylands? So what we did is we grabbed a number of kind of common GPP and ET remotely sensed data products. These spanned a number of different wavelengths, instruments, and models used to generate these proxies of carbon and water cycling, which not going to get into that right now. And we did the same type of correlation analysis with all of these different graphs being the different environmental drivers. On the x-axis are these different ET and GPP products. And on the y-axis is really just the difference between this correlation coefficient derived from eddy covariance and the correlation coefficient derived from remote sensing, here with a negative value where there's an asterisk, so it's significantly different, meaning that there's kind of a higher sensitivity of these remote sensing products to these various environmental drivers. And also note, these data were extracted for the grid cell at these individual flux towers, and they're using the meteorology at these individual flux sites. So this is just how well does this ET or GPP proxy represent what's happening at that site. And if you look at the bottom 4 panels, which are all of the different layers of soil moisture, you'll find that they did pretty well, with the exception of one case there. There was really no if you got 2 panels for light and VPD, and I don't have the temperature one on there, but it's the same exact story as the VPD one. You can see that these remotely sensed products kind of overestimate the sensitivity of fluxes to atmospheric drivers, which kind of, given how a lot of these are produced, a lot of times they don't incorporate soil moisture constraints. It kind of makes sense that they might be behaving that way. And I'll also note that some of these products that are derived directly or indirectly from microwave remote sensing products, this is the Gleam product there and the SMAP GPP product, actually do really well. It's mostly the optical products that are kind of failing, which I think might make sense given what was presented in the last talk here. And also, in the interest of comparing to the last talk, we didn't look at SIF. We probably should, but I would guess that it also does pretty well too. Hopefully, because it's getting something a little more relevant for vegetation function. Okay, so this brings us back to the what if we aren't measuring soil moisture? Remotely sensing these fluxes is something that is also very common, and so is using land surface models to understand carbon and water fluxes. And so what we did next is we got a suite of kind of 11 of the most common models in the CMIP-6 exercise that had all of these different variables present at the time scales we wanted. And again, did the same exact kind of correlation sensitivity analysis here. And that's what you can see. In this case, we just did it for the shallowest layer of soil moisture, so 0 to 10 layer, and this deep layer of soil moisture, which is around 1 meter here. And what should be obvious from this is you can see the soil moisture sensitivity of GPP was really underestimated by almost about half across all of these different CMIP6 models in the aggregate. And there is a lot of variability here, which I'm happy to talk about later, but in the aggregate, they really underestimated how sensitive these fluxes were to soil moisture. But in contrast, the sensitivity of evapotranspiration pretty much matched what we saw at these flux tower sites. What we're doing right now, and it's taking more time than I'd like, is delving into E versus T, because I have a feeling that this is due to kind of compensating errors here, right? If soil moisture sensitivity of GPP is underestimated, it's probably the case that transpiration is also underestimated, and that it's compensated for by a super sensitive evaporative signal, which is something that a number of recent papers have actually found across a lot of these CMIP6 models here. So I think, you know, there are a couple of broader messages, I think, from this analysis here. And that's first, that understanding dryland ecosystems really means understanding soil moisture, and that the role of atmospheric drivers is pretty limited to these transient, largely post-rainfall conditions when soil water is really abundant. I think both of those points are really important to kind of add to the nuance of the debate here. Second is that a lot of these remotely sensed products, you know, they overestimate dryland responses to VPD, which could have important climate change implications as we use these data products moving forward in these regions that are getting hotter and drier. But some of these more physiologically relevant remote sensing products might be really promising for improving that. And thirdly, you know, as every, I think, modeler would understand quite well, there are a lot of limitations in these models, especially regarding soil hydrology and vegetation hydraulics and the interaction between carbon and water cycling. And so I think improving these models in that regard is incredibly important. With that, I'll thank the funders here, and also once it pops up, shameless plug, my lab at West Virginia University is looking for PhD students and postdocs. So if you are or know anyone who's interested, come talk to me or have them send me an email. And I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I'm happy to take questions.
Right there. Oh, microphone.
Thank you. Great talk. Just a quick question. I may have missed this, but for your GPP models, did you look at Matt Dannenberg's Dryland ANA GPP product?
We actually hadn't looked into it for this specific project, but for another one, we are looking into it actually. So this is, the goal with this was really, I mean, Matt was involved in this research, so the goal is really to like have this be accessible for a person like me who's like, okay, what are the most common things that people use? How do those compare to what we can understand these flux towers? But the thing that like that dryland model that Matt developed, I know Mallory Barnes has another one that seems pretty similar. I think those are probably quite promising. Yeah.
Thank you.
So when the condition is very dry, so we know that the atmosphere and the biosphere, they're highly coupled, so that VPD and soil moisture, they are very correlated. So do you think like the for your method, the Pearson correlation coefficient, it can deal with this, the coupling between VPD and soil moisture?
Yeah, I'm guessing that you're a reviewer too from this paper, because they they had the same question. So no, obviously like the correlation analysis can't get at that coupling, but I didn't present it here. We have a couple ways to get around that. First off, we wanted to stick with the correlation stuff just because it's most intuitive as to what the magnitude of those coefficients mean. But we also use partial correlation and something called relative weight analysis, which deals with collinearity between predictor variables quite well. And we found the same exact thing, which is nice. And the other way we did with that is we did this analysis at half-hourly, daily, weekly, and monthly timescales and kind of quantified, you know, it's not directly coupling, but actually saw how directly related soil moisture and VPD were during those periods, and they're very decoupled at these smaller or faster temporal scales. And also the results are almost identical from half hourly to monthly time steps. But yeah, great question.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. All right, next speaker, Mustafa Jabadian from Northern Arizona University. Share your screen. Have your time.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Mustafa, a postdoc at Northern Arizona University, working with Andrew Richardson. So today I'm gonna talk about one of the most understudied topic in flux community. So I'm gonna talk about canopy temperature dynamic across a water to energy limited gradient. So I did most of this work in my previous postdoc with Russell Scott and Bill Smith. Let me move forward. So actually, remote sensing serves remotely sensed surface temperature are directly related to plant physiology, ecology, and plant function. And the interesting thing is that they are in both water and carbon fluxes, and we can obtain them from leaf to global scales. And finally, we can also assess the impact of climate change on ecosystem based on canopy temperature data. So recently, there are more studies that are using canopy temperature data, but they are still understudied, and we need to work more on canopy temperature data on flux towers. So there are different methods to obtain canopy temperature from satellite to the tower level, and they have different spatial and temporal scale. So at kind of coarse spatial scale, we have geostationary satellite like GOES satellite. We have polar orbiting satellite like Landsat and MODIS. Also low inclination orbit spacecraft like EcoStress. And at the better spatial and temporal resolution, we have UAVs, handheld devices, and finally tower mounted thermal cameras. And basically, we are the best temporal resolution can be obtained on tower mounted, because we can just mount the thermal cameras on the tower and get continuous thermal data from those cameras over there. In the first study that I did over the Mount Bigelow Flux Tower in southern Arizona, we had a bunch of thermal flight over the flux tower to study the diurnal canopy temperature dynamic over that site. So we had a thermal drone that we had several flights in a day, but it was really difficult to manage those flights. So there are some weather limitations and also some height limitations and the other limitations that we have is that we cannot get to the leaf temperature that much. But from that result, we wanted to know that how do tree density and height impact canopy temperature in our site. So in that study, we found that comparing the canopy temperature of low density trees and high density trees, we found that the high density trees are about 2.1 degree cooler than low density trees. And comparing the temperature of short trees and tall trees, generally the tall trees were around 2.4 degree cooler than the short trees in our site. And in another study, because in the previous study we couldn't have enough sampling and we couldn't get the leaf temperature, we focused on another study that I used. So I basically mounted the thermal camera on a stand, and we worked on the Santa Rita experimental range with in the rainfall manipulation site to answer the question that holding total rainfall constant, how does rainfall intermittency impact the plant temperature? So we had a really high resolution thermal data, like around 2 millimeter spatial resolution. And with a RGB image classification, we were able to classify annual plants and perennial plants and compare their response to the different rainfall manipulation as a function of plant temperature. So if we compare these two treatments that are more intense, more frequent and less intense rainfall, and less frequent and more intense rainfall, we found that in the less frequent, more intense rainfall, we have more available water in deeper soil, and from that we have more perennial root growth in those treatments, and that will result in cooler annual plants temperature that finally result in more latent flux and more annual plants growth in that site. So it basically says that with this current regime of climate change that we have in Southwest US, that we get less frequent and more intense rainfall, we are going to move toward cooler perennial plant temperature and warmer annual temperature that finally may result in more perennial plants and less annual plants in the region. So, and then I was kind of tired of doing kind of field work in the hot environment of Southern Arizona, and I told my PIs that we need to do something. So I'm not going to go out in the 120 degree and do field work. So we installed our thermal cameras on the towers on the Walnut Gulch site and Mount Bigelow site to get 10-minute interval canopy temperature data from those sites. So the top one is showing the Walnut Gulch site. So the left figure are showing the thermal image, and right figure is showing the RGB image. The middle one is showing the Mount Bigelow data, and also we collaborated with a group in Australia to work on their thermal camera in Tamboramba Flux Tower. And basically, we wanted to compare the response of canopy temperature at different ecosystems. So these ecosystems are really different from each other. So the Walnut Gulch site is a very kind of water limited site. The Tamboramba site is very energy limited site. The Walnut Gulch is a grassland shrubland, and the two other sites are evergreen forest. So the Mount Bigelow is needleaf, the other one is broadleaf. So they are very different from each other, and we were interested to see that how these different ecosystems have different canopy temperature or not. So another interesting differences between those sites is that they also have different leaf sizes. So there are some lab-based studies that they show that the size of the leaves are important, and they have a huge impact on the leaf temperature. So in our study, we have so in our water limited site, we have tiny kind of mesquite leaves, and in Tamboramba we have broadleaf. You have and air temperature, probability density function in different phenological stages: start of season, peak of season, end of season, and dormancy. So we focus on canopy temperature minus air temperature to kind of focus on the leaf water stress, and also normalize the impact of air temperature to the canopy temperature. So in this figure, you see that from top to bottom, that is from our water limited site to our energy limited site, we have cooler canopy temperature minus air temperature. So as we go toward our energy limited site, the deviation of canopy temperature to air temperature is going down. That kind of makes sense because that site is cooler, and the deviation of canopy temperature to air temperature should be cooler as well. And another interesting thing that we see in this plot is that from dormancy to peak of season in our water limited site, the canopy temperature is cooling down, but in our energy limited site, they are heating up. So because they need to reach to their optimum temperature, they need to heat up from dormancy to peak of season, but in the water limited site, they need to cool down from dormancy to peak of the season. Another thing that we explored was the limited leaf homeothermy hypothesis that basically argues that leaf should cool below air temperature at higher temperature, and basically says that there are substantial carbon uptake when leaves are cooler than air temperature. And generally, it says that climate warming will be mitigated by compensatory leaf cooling response. So, but there are some studies that recently kind of rejected that hypothesis. We also found that in our sites, we not only see any cooling response in higher temperature, but we also see a heating response in higher temperature. So this is the plot of canopy temperature to air temperature in all sites, that you see the slope is higher than 1. So that says that in higher temperatures, the plants are warming up, not cooling down. So it means that in global warming, plants are having more issues compared to the things that we were thinking before. So, and also another thing that we see is that the slope is going up from our water limited site to our energy limited site. That basically can be because of the leaf size, because there are some studies that shown that that plants in the water limited site are more resistant to higher temperatures. So generally, they can tolerate more temperatures than energy limited site that they cannot get that much higher temperatures. This is also GPP to canopy temperature minus air temperature. So if the homeothermy hypothesis happen, we expect that we should have some high GPP when canopy temperature is cooler than air temperature. But most of our high GPPs are at the positive side when canopy temperature is warmer than air temperature. So basically, this is also reject the homeothermy hypothesis that we have that expect some cooling response of plant in higher temperatures. And also another thing that we see here is that there is a kind of compound effect of high latent heat flux and high GPP in our water limited site, but the energy limited site, there is no impact of latent heat flux on high GPP. And then we explored another hypothesis that we wanted to know that what is the main driver of canopy temperature in different ecosystems. So we hypothesized that in the energy limited ecosystems, the canopy temperature minus air temperature should be mainly driven by the net radiation, and in the water limited site, it should be mainly driven by the top surface soil water content. And we found the similar results that here in our water limited site, as the soil water content goes up, the canopy temperature minus air temperature goes down, but in our energy limited site, we don't see that response. And by comparing the net radiation and canopy temperature minus air temperature, we see that in the energy limited site, as the net radiation goes up, the canopy temperature minus air temperature goes up, but the story is different in the water limited site, and it is mainly dependent on the amount of soil water content in that site. So as a take-home message, so we showed that plant temperature strongly regulates surface temperature and complicate the relationship between plant gas exchange and environmental drivers, and canopy temperature from different plant functional types or across ecosystems elucidate unique responses to environmental drivers. Also, another thing is that I suggest all tower PIs to think about adding thermal cameras to their towers. That's it. Thank you.
I think we can do one question. Yeah. Oh,
Have you measured transpiration rate as well?
The transpiration rate?
Yeah, of those vegetations.
Oh, actually, so the fact is that because we were focusing on different trees, so in this study, we were just focusing on the canopy temperature, but in a separate study, we are using some models like the PTJPL model to get the transpiration of the individual trees from the canopy temperature. And yeah, that's a good kind of research questions to explore the different transpiration rate based on the canopy temperature data.
All right, we should probably move on to our next activity. Excellent, thank you. All right, the next thing today is we will move to a brainstorming session, remote sensing and fluxes, and Nicola will lead that.
So hi everyone, I'm Nicola Falcom, research scientist from LBNL, and I've been asked to moderate this session. So next 20 minutes, this is a brainstorming session. So I would expect to see people racing for the microphone and tell their idea. So as you know, we are in the remote sensing year, and we want to engage with the community as much as we can. So we really want to hear from you what could be, gaps in your research that can be solved across this community, using this community. What are the needs and opportunities? So also based on the presentation we just saw, we saw that there's a data fusion. We can increase the resolution of course products. So we have so many different type of sensors that can be introduced into your research. So there are definitely opportunities, but we really want to hear from you. Connie is there writing down all whatever you're gonna say. So microphones there. So I think like the idea here is basically trying to understand what could be an activity that could bring, value to the community in a scientific perspective, but also if there's technical challenges, right? Like, for example, yesterday we had a tutorial on remote sensing for those that never saw remote sensing before. We can also organize activities in that sense. But yeah, we really want to hear from you what are gaps or even opportunities that we can, take action for the next year of remote sensing.
Okay, so more than a proposal, I have a question here. And we heard this, some talks about using remote sensing to derive soil moisture, so soil moisture from space. The problem with that is the ESA product is at something like 25-kilometer resolution, and then this map is about like 9-kilometer resolution, and then we're trying to do that with like the tower base. And then even if we get the Meriflux data, some towers may have soil moisture, some towers don't have soil moisture, and even if you have soil moisture, then you have gaps in the soil moisture. So how we fill that? So anyway, my question is there a need for developing a product of soil moisture derived from remote sensing that has higher spatial resolution than the currently available one? My group has developed a product at 250-meter resolution bi-weekly for North America. But of course, these things have been validated and tested and all that. And if there is any need for trying to improve the spatial and temporal resolution for remote sensing soil moisture.
Okay,
that's useful or not?
That's a great idea. And so your group is already doing that, but you want to also to go a higher resolution. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I would like to mention that as an Ameriflux group, we really, every 2 years, we had to talk with NASA and DOE and NASA and tell them what are our needs in terms of satellite products. And, and so based on that, they're gonna develop new missions, and they tell you what is feasible and what is not, and things like that. For example, the last, one of our communication with them the last couple of years was, at least for the DOE, is that we really wanted to have high resolution access to, for example, planet data that are like high temporal resolution and spatial resolution, 3 meters daily acquisition, free for universities, but not for DOE. And we were able to get access to those data too. So, and also, getting hyperspectral on satellites. They are working on that to increase the analysis, for example, soil dust and so on. So this, the needs, we bring your needs, and when we talk to them, this is really important for us to understand. So soil moisture definitely is one of our product that really needs to be much development.
Maybe I'll just add one thing to what Rodrigo said. I think he'd be interested to hear whether that would be useful to people, his product would be useful to people here. Raise your hand or go talk to him, but try to keep that conversation going.
Not all together.
I'm relatively new to the Ameriflux community as well. I'm a grad student, but in the Biomet lab at UC Berkeley, we recently had a UAV drone survey of a subset of our sites. And I know that Ameriflux offers site visits, and I'm curious if, I guess, people here would be interested in having some sort of drone survey be a part of that site visit, being able to request a UAV that could be owned by Ameriflux or at least administered by Ameriflux. Not only the equipment itself, but also the expertise to run one of those surveys. We hired a contracting surveyor because we didn't, when you take a heavy duty drone over a large area with, the wiring harness and many different instruments, it's a lot of spin up time and a lot of, I guess, learning that takes place that you may never need to use again, and you may not have a whole lot of interest in your lab in learning, but you may be able to use just as any other remote sensing product, but custom to your site and then freely shareable to other data users linked to your site. So I'm curious if anybody else would find that useful or thinks that that's a good idea and a good use of Ameriflux funds.
Yeah, we would like to.
So you did this. So what kind of observations were on that drone survey that you did?
For our survey, it was co-captured LiDAR and 10-band multispectral. So we got near infrared and RGB spectral information, but also canopy structure. And our sites are wetlands, but that's a pretty unique application. Most of the Ameriflux sites are not wetlands and probably are even more conducive to things like LiDAR and canopy structure. And that could be useful, I think, to be included with fluxes.
So is that, there is an existing kind of aircraft base, the Neon covers a lot of that. Is that something we should talk with them about expanding where they do their overflights? And we don't need to use you don't need to have a UAV for that, if it's can be done from AV. I want to take out the U.
Sure. Well, connecting those data sets, I think could be something that maybe could be better integrated with Ameriflux sites. Or again, I'm not maybe the best person to know all the ins and outs of how the existing structure works, but.
Thanks. So it makes me think that, I see already, the two different groups have different research. Sebastian, you can say yes or no. But I think I heard that there's something like that, like it already in place where people can share instrumentation or have a collaborative research inside the community. And this could be one of those cases where a group of the community can, provide instrumentation or resources to somebody else in case the instrumentation is not used or other.
Yeah, the drone question is very interesting. We had started a drone program pre-COVID, which sort of died during COVID. It's one of the casualties, I guess. And we're thinking about restarting it, but the capability we had didn't include LiDAR. I mean, if it's a large data set that people need and flying multispectral cameras, I think it might be a good idea to see what we can do and maybe promote across the Ameriflux sites. We were limiting our approach to RGB and retrieval of digital elevation surface models, and automosaicing to document the sites. But as technologies have evolved and there's more payload we can put on drone, I think it goes beyond what we can currently do. But I think that's a conversation we should have. Regarding the drone, the airborne platform that Neon has, somebody from Neon should respond, because it is indeed a very great platform, but it comes at a cost.
Does this work? So I think kind of the elephant in the room, at least to me, is there's flux data, there's remote sensing data, and what typically tends to get in the way is this concept of footprint and changing influence area, and how do we combine gridded data with atmospheric data that essentially represents a plume that at some point touches the surface. Now, over the last decade, it has become possible to actually map out, to disaggregate flux tower data, to map them out, have flux grids essentially. And what I was wondering is whether it might make sense, whether it might be useful to make some of these existing data sets available or more available for the community to try out, whether that might help overcome some of these existing challenges. And if so, whether at some point there could be a collection of these data sets to help us bridge between our different type of observatory platforms.
That's a great idea. Absolutely. Yeah.
Just wanted to add one thing. Going back to what Sebastian said, thank you, Stefan. Ameriflux, DOE, and Neon NSF have a memorandum of agreement, and one of the things that it calls for is that we, the next year or so, do a workshop together or think about products together. And something we brainstormed was, could we do something with remote sensing together? Because Neon is developing tools through Google Earth Engine and has this airplane with hyperspectral and so many great resources. So that's something, if people want to follow up on, let me know. We want to sort of slowly move towards that next year. Thanks.
And Margaret, just to add to that, I think our first move in the direction is the breakout tomorrow, where we have Ameriflux and Neon breakout. So
yeah, great. Yeah, other ideas, needs, challenges?
And for me, I'm just advancing weaker and lighter data each year, because it is based on the point cloud. So we can get the biomass estimation based on this point cloud, and then we can just compare this biomass estimation with our flux estimation of biomass, and then we can do some evaluation about either LiDAR is good to have plant biomass estimation compared to the flux data. So we can just do the annual check of our flux data based on annual scanning of the plant canopy. And because LiDAR can have very accurate estimation, it can reach to 2 millimeters. Then we can have a very good estimation of biomass around at canopies. So that this is some of my idea. I'm just popped up some idea.
So you're saying that we need like a validation data set that may be derived from LiDAR because it's really precise for biomass. So you can use that to validate your flux data.
I'm just thinking we can have one way to just check our flux measurement, or we can improve our flux measurement based on annually scanned LiDAR point cloud. And this is to merge flux measurement and also add remote sensing technology. So I guess we can do, yeah. Yeah. So I'm just thinking this is a one way for us to merge Flask method and also add remote sensing approach. So yeah, so this is
5 minutes.
Five minutes.
That's good.
Any other?
I would just add to what Sebastian brought up and other people have brought up, but yeah, more products like, that Open ET product paper that just came out where they took all the Ameriflux data and got it into a nice pool of, standardized products available throughout the US. The Tesla Open ET product was a great idea, and something like that for many different things that are collected at the Flux towers. If that could be assembled and put into a package or easily downloadable that people could use to test their remote sensing models or land surface models, that would be, I think, improve a lot of the usability of the data. And I would also just add, because I am a dry land folk guy too, is that the interannual variability is really important. And what we're finding, at least at dry land sites, is that none of the models are getting interannual variability right. They're really dampened interannual variability for fluxes, ET, and GPP, and that kind of stuff.
And it goes to your experiment idea.
Yeah, so from the remote sensing technical committee, we also thinking like it would be really great if we come to you guys and maybe we can really develop like an experiment to really answer critical questions, science question that you have, and maybe we can, define or design experiment that we can really collectively make. And what Stefan was saying, start to using footprint. Footprint. We know we have different algorithms to create that, but nobody's really using it. And we have remote sensing at different scale. We can actually measure things using remote sensing at different scale, proximity, UAV, satellite, and so on. And so I would like to encourage you to come to us with ideas for a collective experiment where really the community can come together. Then something we really think of.
I'd like to echo what Russell Scott just mentioned. I think that should go both ways, right? So not just serving the data, Flux data for remote sensing community. It should go the other way too. So a lot of Flux tower can be very beneficial, have a cutoff of the remote sensing product. We saw the cutoff of all this have been creating so many opportunities in the past. And there are many, many more remote sensing data available right now to become available. And that will be beneficial if you can talk to someone and have something like a leverage. We don't have the fly drone. There are too many sites right now. It's impossible to scale up. So if we can leverage something like that, I have a cutoff for all of Ameriflux sites that would be beneficial. For example, Martha just mentioned something about hybrid product, 30-meter day resolution and land surface temperature. If they can make available for all the Ameriflux site, there will be a lot of activity going on based on that. So.
Maybe we have a time for the one more, or
I would just have a add on. Bill, you were mentioning earlier. Thank you. Bill, you were mentioning earlier that there might be efficiencies in terms of co-locating overflights with existing platform, remote sensing platform like Neon AOP, for example. So I do know of instances in the past where this was actually possible to take into account. So to fly an additional flight line, for example, to cover an additional tower and whatnot. So if you're interested in something like that, feel free to get in touch with us, and we're happy to coordinate with our AOP team, Airborne Observation Platform at NEON.
The us was Neon, yeah?
Pardon me?
The us to get in touch with is Neon?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Chris, myself,
Super.
I guess we're good to go for the break.
All right. Hi, everyone. Just a reminder that the break goes until 4:55. Please come back here at 4:55. Thanks.